So this video is going to be about the Loft command in Inventor. The Loft command is very useful for creating complex shapes and forms. It's for when you want to change the shape or the size of a profile along its length, unlike an extrusion which stays the same shape and size along its entire length. It's not something that you need to expressly know for National 5. For Higher you definitely do, but National 5's this is still a useful thing for you to know about because it might help you to model something in your assignment, for example. So to create a loft we need 2 separate sketches, and usually that means we need 2 separate work planes. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make my first sketch on one of my ground work planes. Now, as with all of these videos, you could spend quite a lot of time making sure that they were dimensioned correctly, but all I'm trying to show here is a basic technique, so I am not worrying about dimensioning. So there's my first sketch, and to make it easier, I'm going to make that ground plane visible, like that. Whoops, didn't work. There you go. So there's my ground plane, that's the orange one. The next thing that I'm going to do is I need to create another plane up here. So I'm going to use an offset plane inside the drop down from the plane menu. And I'm going to offset it from this plane here. And I'm just going to drag it. Again, I could type in a specific dimension that I'm after, but I'm just going to drag it. Going to make a new sketch on this second work plane. So I've got 2 work planes that I'm working in between and 2 sketches. Now, what I'm after is I'm actually after another square which is going to go in the middle of this one. So I'm grabbing these lines using project geometry so that I can reference it, and I'm going to change to a 2-point center rectangle so that I can snap into the center of my square and make a new smaller square. And then just to tidy everything up, I'm going to go back and delete those lines that I used for my reference so that it's easier for you to see what I'm after. So I finished that sketch. So I now have 2 squares, big one and a smaller one, and they are separated by 2 work planes that are offset by each other. Again, I could be very specific and say that I've got a definite dimension distance between these 2 work planes, but I'm just doing it by eye. So we're going to go for the Loft command. It's up in the Create tab, and we're going to click on the first square, and then we're going to click on the second square, and that gives us our loft. I'm going to click OK, and then you can see what that's created. In this case, it's created like a square-based pyramid that's cut off, because I've just gone from one shape to a smaller shape. Now, what I could do, if I undo this and go back into that sketch. Now, if I go back and I delete this first square, something that I could do, I'll delete the center point as well. You know what, just delete the whole thing. What I could do is if I use a 3-point center, you can do the same thing, reference the original rectangle. If I go for a 3-point center, and I'm going to put in 45 degrees for my square, I can make a square that's tilted or rotated by 90 degrees. And this time, when I loft it, click on square 1, click on square 2. Yep, even though I've not deleted those reference lines, it still works okay. This time, I get a sort of twist happening because it's pulling the information from, well, that spun round at some point. It's pulling the information from the bottom square up into the top square. So that's a very basic loft between 2 of the same shapes. So you don't just need to loft between 2 of the same shapes of different sizes, we can loft between completely separate shapes as well. Now, I just spent some time showing you all of the different shapes that you can get hold of. You know, you could do a square to a triangle or a square to a pentagon, loads of different things that you could do. I'm going to do a square to a circle, like that. It could be a circle that's bigger, it could be a circle that's smaller, and then again, just to tidy everything up, I am going to delete those two lines that I projected for reference, just so that the only thing that you're really focusing on is the loft that's happening. Again, press the loft, and I'm going to loft between this square and this circle. So I click my two profiles, click OK, and there you go, there's my loft happening. So this time, as well as the shape and the size, as well as the size changing across the length of the loft, the shape changes as well. Other ways that we can use the loft tool to create even more complex profiles and forms, the examples that we've had before, the loft has been happening straight up. If I want to do an offset loft, do exactly the same setup, two work planes that are offset from each other, and then let's use, what will we use? Let's use a polygon. If we go for a triangle, so 3 sides to our polygon, and this time I'm just going to do it off to the side, and I'm going to try and get my polygon as straight as I can, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, click done and finish the sketch. So this time the shape that we are lofting to is a lot further along than directly above our first shape. So when I click loft this time, and I loft between the square and the triangle, and click OK, I get a much more complex form. Okay, once again, we're changing the shape, we're changing the size, but we're also changing the direction. And what we've ended up with, because of the particular quirk of going from 4 sides to 3 sides in our loft, we've got this little deformity. So sometimes you have to be quite careful with a lofted profile and check that it actually makes sense. In this case, it doesn't quite, and it hasn't quite worked, but it does get across the idea that your lofts don't have to be directly above each other. Now, we've seen in other videos as well, there's plenty of ways to make cones and pyramids within Inventor, and another way is actually by using the loft tool. And what we do, instead of creating a shape for it to loft to, we're going to create a point. Now, so that I get it dead in the centre, although it doesn't have to be, once again I'm going to use projector to reference my previous square, put point right in the middle, and then to tidy everything up, I'm just going to delete those lines, which of course you do not have to do. Finish the sketch, and we're going to go back to loft. And this time we're clicking the square and our point, and it will loft up into a lovely, perfect little square-based pyramid. And depending on the kind of shape that you created and how complex it is, you would get a different shaped pyramid. So one of the other ways that we can increase the complexity of the shapes that we loft is by lofting not just between 2 shapes, but we can loft between 3 or even more shapes. And the way that we're going to do that is, once again, start on our ground plane. I'm going to use a circle this time. So, nice circle. Again, you could dimension, but I'm not going to bother. To create my other planes, I'm going to make this one visible just to help me out a bit. I'm going to zoom out a bit so that I've got plenty of space to work with. And I'm going to offset a plane from this original plane. Drag it up nice and far. Now, what I want this particular shape to do is I want it to come almost to a line. I want it to become a really thin rectangular profile, almost a line. I'm going to create an extremely thin, or as thin as I can make it pretty much, rectangle. And I'm going to give the rectangle a thickness of just 0.1 millimeters. So it's really, really thin. It's basically a line. Finish that sketch. And then on the other side, so I'm going to make another work plane. And this time I'm going to offset it below. Now, again, I can just drag it, or I can type in a minus value for how low I want this to go. And I'm going to zoom so that we can see everything. There we go. Make a new sketch on this plane, and this time we're going to go for a rectangle which is a bit wider, a lot wider. And I have no idea what this is going to do, but let's see. So I'm going to loft between the first rectangle, loft between the circle, and then loft up to the line. Click OK. And what that's done is it's created a very bizarre but very complex profile. Now this isn't really anything, but this could be a good way of creating something like the handle of a object like a games controller, or a tube-like form that needs to get smaller as it goes towards the base of the tube, or something like a vase or a cup, or anything really that has to change shape along the length of the shape, rather than extrusion which stays the same the whole way along. So as well as using Loft to create quite complex shapes, we can also use it to create complex shapes that we have a bit more control over. And to do that, we use a command called Loft between rails, or Loft along rails, or Loft along a path. Now I've got two squares here which are pretty much the same size, so if I do a loft between them, all I end up with is straight edges. Pretty normal. Could have used an extrusion, didn't need to use a loft. What I want to do though is I want to find a work plane even that cuts in between those two profiles, and then I want to make a new sketch on that plane. Then what I want to do is I'm going to use the spline tool to draw in between the two planes, and so that I can get a reference point I'm going to use project geometry between these 2 points at the edges, and then back to the spline tool. Now the spline tool lets me create quite a complex curve, and I'm just going to draw this sort of wiggly shape in between the two of them, wiggly line. Now when I go to Loft, I can click the first rectangle and the second rectangle, and at first I still have that boring regular extrusion, but then if I click rails and I pick my line, I get this. I get a more complex wiggly loft that I've been able to control. So that can be really, really useful for making sure that the complex forms that you create are what you want to create.